Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my slides at this time. Um, well, good morning. Happy Tuesday. Thank you for joining me for this circulation problem item workshop. As circulation staff, we all know that you deal with problem items regularly, but there's just so many different variables that can affect the situation. So the purpose of this session is to focus on using our available documentation to help make informed decisions around how to handle problem items. And in this case, we are specifically looking at damaged and claimed items. So our session today is going to have two main parts. The first part will be a presentation style where we're going to look at the documentation together and walk through some examples. And then for the presentation portion of this section, we will specifically be looking, starting with the CCS intra-billing policy. Then we're going to move into talking about damaged items, and after that, claimed items. So this part is going to be recorded so that it can be posted online and also shared with those who registered. Now, the second part is going to be the workshop part. And for the workshop, we're not going to record. We will instead break into small groups to work through some example scenarios together and then come back together to discuss and share as a bigger group. So, as always, there's a lot we want to pack in. So I want to get started. Now, when we talk about problem items like damaged copies and claims returns in a consortium setting, it's important to know what policies are in place that relate to payments. So for policies, we will look to our governing board. Governing board policies, these are posted on the CCS website so anyone can access. And they can be found under the About Us governing board, or I'm sorry, governing documents. And there you can find the PDF governing board policies. So the policies state in the introduction that these policies are to inform members of their rights and responsibilities. So these are the rules that we will all adhere to as members of CCS. Now, today we're going to focus on page 42 of the policies, and this page addresses billing for intra-CCS items. So the policy defines intra-CCS ILL being when all libraries involved in the transaction are CCS libraries. So what that is saying is that this policy applies not only to items sent through delivery, but also reciprocal borrowing transaction between CCS libraries and CCS patrons. Now, our policy states that neither CCS nor CCS members shall bill nor reimburse members for lost or damaged intra-CCS loan material. I know some libraries refer to their patrons as members, so I do want to just clarify here that when our policy references members, it refers to libraries as members of CCS. This part of the policy is saying that libraries will not invoice one another or send reimbursement to one another for materials. So CCS libraries do not send money back and forth for items. And the next section of the policy states that payment for intra-CCS loan material may be made at any library. So generally, patrons are able to pay for their fees at any CCS library. As a patron, I can go into any CCS library and pay the fee for my lost or damaged item that's on my card. And then the policy also states that member libraries shall apply best practices and local policies when determining whether to accept reduced payment or waived charges for interest CCS loan material. So this part of the policy recognizes that libraries may have different local practices or policies set by your own board related to waiving fees or accepting partial charges. It also recognizes that there's a lot of gray area when it comes to working with patrons, and you may need to just apply your best judgment and best practices based on the individual situation. So in terms of applying this policy to today's topic, This policy is saying that we agree to make our usual efforts to recover our items or the cost of items, but we are able to apply local practices in terms of waiving or reducing fees. So again, when we're working with problem items, it's important to understand related CCS policies and where to find them. We're next going to examine damaged items. So damaged item procedures can be found on our website. In the How To section, select Public Services as your department. And in Public Services, you will see a list of topics, and you'll want to focus on the topic headed Patron Accounts. Once you expand this section, that is where you will find the damaged item procedures. So these procedures approach what to do with a damaged item if it's returned to your library. The procedures attempt to be broad enough so that a library can find guidance on how to handle as many scenarios as possible. As we all know, there's just so many variables that staff can encounter when working with damaged items. Just a few examples, libraries who have sorters will likely deal with more items that have already been removed from the patron's record, while a library that manually checks in items may identify damaged materials before they're checked in. You could be in a situation where you work with the patron face to face, or you could be in a situation where the patron returns the book anonymously to your return bins. Finally, there's times when you're going to be the point of return, but you were not involved with any other point of the transaction. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of variables, but just some of what you may experience and some of what may impact how you approach a situation. We all know that situations with damaged items can become very, very weird very quickly. Now, when presented with a damaged item, we will use the procedures as a starting point. Since these are our procedures and not policy, we can also adapt the procedures to fit the current situation. You can take the situation, use the procedures, and then also apply your best judgment to see the best way to move forward. I do want to take just a moment and highlight one important variable you'll be dealing with, and that is the variable if your library submits patrons to collections. So there are certain qualifications a fee must meet to count towards collection submission. Um, First is that only certain fee reasons qualify for submission, and these are the fee reasons of replacement cost or processing fee. The second is that the fee must be tied to an item record. Now, when you mark an item as lost or when an item transitions to lost, the fee automatically meets these qualifications, right? So there's nothing else for the library to think about. However, if you're manually adding a fee, these may impact how your library is going to enter the fee based on if you need that to qualify for collections. And as we go through the documentation, you will see this called out at times. So I'm just going to exit the slides and go to the procedures. We'll kind of be jumping back and forth here for the rest of the session. Now, with the damaged item procedures, there are a couple major sections to the procedures. And again, these approach what to do with a damaged item from the perspective that the item was returned to your library. So the very first thing the procedures ask is if the patron is present or if the item was returned anonymously, like through the book drop. I don't know if anyone here remembers those old choose your own adventure book series from like the 80s and 90s. Think of this as like the not fun version of that series. So based on how the item was returned to you, you'll be directed on where to go next to figure out the best way to remove forward. Now, the more involved path is if that item was returned anonymously through the book drop or in a bin. So if that's the case, you will be directed on where to go based on if it's your library's item, if the patron is your patron, or if their home library is another library, and potentially where the item was checked out. Excuse me. And then from here, you'll be directed to a place in the body of the procedures, either section A, section B, or section C. And then how closely you follow these steps in sequence may depend on what other factors are involved. Again, for example, if the item has already been checked in off the patron's account, or if it's still checked out to them. So the next thing I want to do is run through a couple different scenarios involving intra-CCS items to see how these procedures can be applied. So in our first scenario here, DVD was returned to our library. And before we check the item in, we see that this item is fully cracked in half. So our first step is to figure out who owns the item. And then we need to see which patron has the item checked out and where it was checked out. So the easiest thing to determine here is who owns the item. And just looking at the DVD, we can tell that it belongs to another library. Now to figure out the rest, there's a couple different ways you can determine. I find the easiest way is to actually look at the item record and look at the circulation tab. So I have a couple different barcodes here that we're going to pretend we have these items in hand so I can scan them. And within the item record, I can go to the circulation tab. Since this item is checked out, I will get my circulation information from the current borrower and loaning branch section. So here I can see that this item was checked out by our patron and from our library. So with this information, I can come over to the chart and I can kind of go through and just determine, is this our item? No. Is this our patron? Yes. And was it checked out at our library? Yes. And we can combine these variables and then be directed to the appropriate section. In this case, it is section B. So let me click there to scroll down. In terms of section B will then ask if we are sure that the item is damaged or if we're not quite sure. We know that our disk is completely cracked in half. So this is a situation where I am sure of the damage and I know that the owning library will not be able to circulate it. So looking at section B1, we can follow our local procedure for contacting the patron and applying the charges. Now, once we're ready to apply charges, since this item, let me go back to Leap here, is still checked out to our patron, we can either mark this item as lost, which will automatically apply the charges to the patron's account and update that circulation status, or we can manually apply a charge to the user's account and manually update the circulation status of the item. So why are there different options and why would I choose one over the other? Now, libraries may have different local procedures and may need to track fees differently. So that first option of marking the item as lost. Now, your library may use this because you want a more direct workflow, right? There's fewer steps. Or maybe your library participates in collection submission. And if you do, as we just talked about a few moments ago, there are certain conditions that that fee needs to have to be included. And by making something lost, you know that the fee is going to qualify. The second option of manually applying the fee and manually updating the status of lost, your library may opt for this method if you prefer to track fees a certain way. Um, and maybe you want to use that damage circulation status. So for this scenario, we are going to go with the first option and mark the item as lost. So since we are ready to apply charges, I will need to access the patron's record. You may be keying or scanning in. Since I'm in the item record in the circ tab, I'm just going to click on the patron record to be linked there. In the patron's record, we will go to their Out Overdue tab. I will select the checkbox next to the item and click Declare Lost. So with this, I can apply the charges to the patron's account. Just get there. And when I click OK, the charges will be applied to the patron's account and the item status has now been updated to lost. Since the item is in lost status, it's no longer available to circulate. We do not need to take additional action with the item. So recapping this example, even though the item belonged to a different library, since the item was completely damaged, we were able to contact the patron to notify them, mark the item as lost to apply charges, and update the item status. I just need a sip of water there. Let's check out one other damaged item scenario. So here, a book was returned to our library. We know this book belongs to another library. After it was checked in and set in transit, we noticed some water damage to the pages, but aren't quite sure if it's extensive enough to count as a fully damaged item. So again, we want to figure out who had this item checked out and where it was checked out from. So I'm going to go back into Leap. Let me close out our records from our first example, and I'm going to pretend to scan the next one. So in this item record, I will again go to the circ tab. This item has already been checked in. So what we're going to do is we're going to refer to the last use information. This item, we can tell from the barcode prefix that this item was checked out by another library's patron, but it was checked out at our library. So we'll again come to damaged item procedures and use that chart to determine what actions we should take. So this is not our item. It's not our patron, but it was checked out at our location. So we have no to the item, no to the patron, yes to our library. And once again, we are directed to section B. So unlike the last example where we were sure the item cannot be circulated, this time we're not quite sure if the damage is severe enough to take the item out of circulation or not. So looking at the instructions for section B2, we will reach out to the owning library. And while we're working with the owning library, we'll still follow our local procedures for notifying the patron. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can work with the owning library. The easiest way, and the one I recommend starting with if you can, is to take a picture and attach it to the email to the owning library. So this way, the owning library has a visual to assess the item without sending it back and forth. If you do need to send the item back, the procedures include instructions for what to do. And if you do need to send the item back to the owning library, just make sure that you clarify between one another if the item is then meant to be sent back to your location or not. So let's say here we emailed the owning library and they determined the item cannot be circulated. So per the next section of the instructions, our steps are to apply the charges to the patron's record and then manage the item. So, like I said earlier, this item has already been checked in off the patron's card and it's currently in transit. Let me go back to the item record. We see the status here that it's in transit to the home library. So we may have a couple extra steps that we need to take. For this example, we're going to pretend like our library does not participate in collections and we do track damaged item fees. So in order to apply that damaged material fee, I'm going to open up the patron's account and we're going to manually apply a charge. So let me open up the patron's account tab, click add charge, and then I will enter the amount of the item, which you can find in the item's record. And then in terms of fee reason, this is where I can select either replacement cost if I am a collections library or damaged material if I want to track damaged fees. The next step is to scan, key in, or copy paste the item barcode. Now, this step is important because it will link the item record to the fee. This allows staff to more easily access the item information that's tied to the fee. And again, this doesn't factor into our example here, but again, if you are a collections library, the fee must be linked to the item record to be eligible to count towards submission. So if you are working with the owning library on this item, either library may apply the charge, whatever is going to be the most appropriate for your situation. However, what we want to avoid, we do not want a library to apply charges without the knowledge of the return library, because we want to make sure that the patron is not surprised by charges and that the return library has the opportunity to follow through with any patron communication before charges are applied. So let me click add charge to complete adding that fee. So again, let's see. With our documentation, we've completed step 2. We've applied the charges to the patron's record. And the next thing we need to do is step 3 to manage the item. So the method you use here is going to depend on if it is a local item or if it's an intra-CCS item and what permissions you have. So if the item was in lost status, like our last example, there is nothing else that you need to do. This item, however, has already been checked in and currently has a status of in transit. So we want to clear that in transit status, so it's not showing that it's traveling back to its home library, and we'll need to update the status to a different circulation status. So to do this, I will scan the item into check-in and clear the in transit. Follow the prompts as needed if there are holds. So for this item, there is a hold. I'm not going to transfer for the hold, but I do want to replace that hold. And then when the item says it's going to go back in transit, say no. And this will prompt the item status to become available. And when the status is available, that means that we have options to manually update that circulation status. So whether or not you can do the next steps depends on permissions, or you may need to grab a manager. So if you are in the circulation managers or the cataloging permission group, you can you can open up the item record and you can update the circulation status right from the item record. If you don't have these permissions, again, you probably just need to tap into your manager. So in the item record, I will click on the details tab and update my status to damaged. So to recap this situation, we had an item that was slightly water damaged, and we weren't sure if we would be able to circulate or not. So we determined the level of damage with help from the owning library. As the point of return, we notified the patron, and then we manually added the fee to the patron's account and manually updated the item's circulation status. Let me pause just for a second to check on chat. So can we change the status in the check-in portion to damage like we do for repair? If it is your own item, you can update the status in check-in using that manage item dialog. If the item belongs to another library, I don't believe, even with full permissions, I don't believe you are able to update the status from check-in. And another question, if we need to use the circ status of damage, or can we follow local procedure? You can. So if there is a different status that fits in with local procedure, you can use that. Oh, thank you. Let me check the, from scenario number 2, instruction B2, does it say the owning library adds fees? Let me go back and see. If the owning library decides the item needs to replace, apply the charges to the patron's record. It doesn't specify which library needs to add the fees. So I would say that it's whichever library fits best with the situation. My guess is most of the time it's going to be whatever library is working with the patron. I'm just scanning to make sure I'm not missing anything here. But again, I just want to emphasize that whichever library is adding the fees, just make sure the patron is aware before they're added so there's no surprises. Okay. Keep those questions coming. So we've just looked at a couple of different damaged item scenarios and how to walk through the procedure. So what happens next with the item record? I'm going to pause just for a second to check out chat here. Note
states
there, sorry, Maggie, yes. Note states that returning library, no owning is adding fees. Yes, let me go back to the procedures here. If I can exit out of my slides. Yes, so there is a note here that just says that the owning library should not apply the bill without the knowledge of the return library.
You stated a few minutes ago too, during that conversation, that we don't want to surprise the patron with the bill on there.
Mm-hmm.
So that I like my notes I wrote where return library reaches out to the patron. So if we, what is your preference? I mean, recommendation. I would, at our library, we wouldn't, I probably wouldn't override and, make the charge a patron from a distance, if that makes sense. I would let the library that has the materials put the bill on my patron's record if that was the case.
I think that makes sense. I think whatever library is working with the patron from the start, that is the logical choice. It's hard with these situations to apply blanket. It should always be this library, it should always be that library. So avoiding speaking absolutes, I think it's logical to have whichever library is working with the patron apply the charges. But I guess also to just follow whatever is going to be the best in your particular situation. I hope that makes sense, Belinda. Let's see. On more than one occasion, I've had the lending library inform us that their patron damaged our item and the loaning library will not be charging the patron house rules. So whose decision is it to charge, the owning or the loaning library? So again, the general approach that we have here with damaged items, with problem items in general, and let me go back to the slide. We want to make the usual efforts to recover items or cost of items, but we do have the agency to apply local practices for waiving or reducing fees. We are not sending money back and forth, so any money that the payment library takes in is going to remain at their location. So in terms of whose decision is it to charge, again, we would expect that the loaning library would make those efforts to work with the patron, but they have the ability to apply their local practices. What happens if you check in the item and a fee was already applied to the account? So we are fine free. Would we keep the charge in the account and send it in transit? So if you check in the item, if the item was checked out at a fine-free library, it would not have. Tuesday, are you talking about overdue fees? While we're waiting for clarification
Can
on
you hear
that.
me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Okay. What I'm trying to say is, like, maybe the other library had already put the item as lost
Okay.
in their billing or whatever. They went to look for it. The item had basically expired. It got to the point of billing. And so it got billed to the patron's account. The patron walks into our library and says, "Oh, I found the book. Here it is." Are we able to waive that fine because we're fine free as long as or is there a time frame where a replacement cost have already been, the item they already purchased another item?
I would say that if a library has already purchased a replacement copy, the original item record should be deleted. So when you scan the item, it should come out as like no record found. So I think if you check the item in and it accepts the check-in and clears the item, then accept that back.
I don't know how to explain it. Okay,
Sure.
let's say
that. Yeah. Why don't you hold on to that, and maybe when we get to the group discussion, we can come back to it.
Okay.
Cool.
Got it.
Perfect. Okay, let me just go back to the slide we were on. So in terms of like what happens after that item is lost or paid and managed, we have a couple reports that will be able to give you information of items with related statuses. So there is a web report. So this is a report that's built and compiled by CCS. This report is called Monthly Lost and Missing and Bindery Damage, and it's found in the statistics section of web report. So this report compiles on the first of every month, and it lists items belonging to your library that have these statuses. So some tabs list items that were updated to one of these statuses the previous month. And so this means the report will include your items that were sent out via interest CCS loan and became lost and damaged. Other tabs list all lost and damaged items, and then they separate them out based on if the item was paid or waived the previous month. And then there's also a report archive for this report where you can find previous entries from previous months. So your library can focus on items based on your local workflow. So for example, do you replace items soon after they're paid for? If so, then you may opt to use the current report and looked at that lost, the paid wave tabs. Or if your library waits a couple months before reordering, you may opt to use the archive and then use the report compiled maybe 2 months ago to inform your reordering. So if you or your selectors have questions about this report or how to incorporate it into your workflow, please don't hesitate to reach out through the help desk, and we can consult with you on that. So the next part of our training is going to look at claim returns. So claim returns occur when a patron claims that they do not have an item on their card. Staff can mark the item as claim return or claim never had. There is a third method of claim missing parts if an item is just missing. Oops, sorry, my slides aren't keeping up with me. There we go. A third method of claim missing parts if an item is missing, say, just like a disc of a multi-disc set. Claim missing parts is optional and it requires additional setup for an automated notice. So again, reach out to CCS if you are interested. So a claim will remain active on the patron's card until it's resolved. And per governing board policy, a patron can have up to 5 current claims on their card. Once a patron tries to claim a 6th item, I'm not sure if anyone's run into this message when working with a patron before, staff will receive an alert saying that the user is at the maximum number of claims allowed. And if patrons and staff move forward with claiming that 6th item, the patron will be hard blocked and will not be able to use their card until at least 1 item is claimed. Further, Polaris records the patron's lifetime claims. So this number adds up all the claims made for this account. So even if the patron resolves all their claims, you can still know how many times staff have claimed items for a user since we went live on Polaris in 2018. So our claim procedures, they're found in the same area as the damaged item procedures. So on our website, you'll again look at the how-to section, focus on the public services department, and expand the patron accounts section. And the page in question here is the claimed item making a claim. So let me go to that page now. So in addition to an overview about how claims work, this page provides instructions on how to claim an item that's currently checked out to a patron, a recommended workflow for claiming an item that's already transitioned to lost, and guidance for how to monitor an item in claim status. So you'll notice these procedures are definitely more straightforward than our damaged item procedures. Oops, I'm sorry. One variable that may impact the claims process is the stage at which your library claims an item. Now, some libraries will claim an item when they're beginning the search process. Other libraries will make the claim only after they're done searching, only when they know they're not holding that patron responsible for the item. So this is why in the claims procedures, they don't instruct when to claim an item, just how to do it. So the when part is up to your library and your workflow. Now there is a portion, sorry for all the scrolling up and down. There is a portion here on interest CCS claims. So it states that libraries can make a claim on an intra-CCS item without notifying the owning library. So a library does not need permission from the owning library to claim an item. Just like with damaged items, libraries will make those usual efforts to recover the items or the cost of items. So the expectation is that we're checking shelves for the items to see if it was returned without being checked in. Now, even though these procedures say you can make a claim without notifying the owning library, you can still absolutely reach out to the library if it's relevant to the situation and relevant to your workflow. So for the claims section, I want to take us through one scenario that can potentially be a little more involved than just a straight claim. So in this scenario, an item is checked out to a patron. It's so overdue, it transitions into lost status. However, the patron now comes to us and is claiming they returned the item. So your library is going to follow your local practice, whether it's looking for the item now or later, filling out local paperwork if you use it. But one difference in this situation is that the item is currently in lost status. So there's a couple different things that happen. One major thing that you might want to consider here is that no claim count has been added to the patron's record yet. So at your library, like this may be okay, may fit in with your local procedure. You may have a workflow in place to handle these situations. If you don't, the claims documentation does have a recommended workflow, and this is what we will use in our example here. So with this workflow, our end goal is to take the item out of lost status and make it a claim. So to do this, we will check the item in, check the item back out to the patron, and then claim it. So I'm going to go back in here and clear out those records from my last example. I have my patron ready. So here's my patron, and it has that lost item. So that first step, we're going to check it in. I will need the barcode number to check it in. So I'm going to get to a place where I can copy the number and paste it into my check-in. There's several ways you can do this. If you work with Leap, you know that there are many different ways that you can access a record number. So let me check the item in. If the item is eligible to fill holds, again, you'll need to review those pop-ups. And you may also need to waive lost fees while you're searching for the item, again, depending on your local workflows and procedures. So now that we've checked the item in, the status of the item is now available, which means I can go back to my patron, I can check it out, and I can make it a claimed item. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to scan it at checkout. Even though I can access the item here under my Out Overdue tab, I tell people to hit this complete button so that the full checkout transaction is completed. It's good practice just to make sure those transactions are completed so records aren't hung up on the back end waiting for the next sequential transaction to be recorded. And then I can go back into my patron account here, if I can get the correct one up. And now that I have this item out, I can then go into my Out Overdue tab, select the item, and make a claim on it. Once the bill has, you'll see, been removed from the patron's account, and once I hit claim, they now have an active claim on their current claim count, and it's been added to the total claims count. So this does count towards that cap of 5. If you have a serial claimer or you need to keep your eyes on this number, it now counts towards our numbers. So if it comes to the point where your library does want to charge the patron for this item, you are still able to mark something as lost from the claims tab. So just kind of recapping this scenario, again, it's one you might not run into too much, but if you do run into it, we have a recommended workflow that you can use as guidance for how to get a claim onto your patron's account. So this does bring us to the topic of resolving claims. A claim will remain current or active until it's resolved. There's a couple ways that you can resolve a claim. So you can resolve it just like we did previously, marking an item as lost and charging fees. Or if the item is recovered, checking the item in will also resolve the claim. And if the item still has not been resolved within 1 year, CCS will delete those item records that have had a status of claim for 1 full year. We do this work monthly. And there is a how-to page on the website that details the different way to resolve claims. Just very quickly talking about reports. I've mentioned claim reports here before. The report I'm referring to is a web report found under the BIB and item management section. This report runs daily and lists items related to your library currently in claimed status. So you have, you'll see a list of items owned by your library in claimed status and items claimed by your library. Okay. So I have some questions here. Let me just pull them up. Yes, if the claim is waived after a year by CCS, does it still remain on the patron's lifetime claim count? That's a good question. It does. So you will, even if the item is deleted before the claim is resolved, you will still have that lifetime claim count. So this concludes the presentation part of the webinar. The next part of the session is going to be the discussion section. So at this time, I'm going to stop our recording.